Thank you for watching this online class presentation from Cedarville University. Cedarville is one of just a few Christian universities that offers a civil engineering program, equipping students to improve infrastructure to make a difference in the world for Christ. We invite you to learn more at cedarville.edu.
All right, so in a few minutes here, we're going to get to a lot of charts, chart day in eschatology, which, if you're on it at all, you know it has just some visuals to try to depict various views on various views of tribulationalism, millennialism, and those things as well. So a couple things first. First off, Abby asked last time, I believe, an idea of like, okay, antichrist, and are we going to talk about that? And my answer is maybe not the way you're thinking of, but I'm going to show you some texts. Where do we go in the Bible to think through that topic? So if you have Bibles, if you want to jot them down, as well as we go through, this will be brief, but I would go to a few, starting with Daniel 9. We read it last time in Daniel 9. We read 24 to 27 last time. And there is, in the latter part of these verses, in verse 26, there's end with wars and desolations are decreed, and he shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week. That last set of 7 years, we said. And for half the week, he'll put an end to sacrifice and offering. And on the wing of abomination shall come one who makes desolate until the decreed end is poured out on the desolator. Which you read that and say, okay. So note as well in Matthew 24, Jesus talked about this abomination of desolation. Referring back to this text, I think, here, to say there's someone who's going to desolate in this way worship practices in that time, abominations there. Then in Daniel 12 as well, Daniel 11. Daniel 11, if you guys read Daniel at all, which you should, has got a lot of prophetic literature on future rulers on planet Earth. Near context, think a lot of like Persian rulers, Greek rulers. There's a lot of things there in terms of detail that are actually amazing in Daniel 11 because they've not yet taken place. And then they do. If you read history, these things took place in history after Daniel prophesied them. It's intriguing to see how that works. So in verse 29, there's this text here, the time appointed he returned and come to the south. It shall not be this time as it was before. For such a team shall come against him. He'll be afraid and withdraw, and shall turn back and be enraged and take action against the holy covenant. That covenant language there from chapter 9 as well. He'll turn back and pay attention to those who forsake the holy covenant. Forces from him shall appear and profane the temple and fortress, and shall take away the regular burnt offering and set up the abomination that makes desolate. That's just like 9, 26 to 27. Exact same thing. He will seduce with flattery those who violate the covenant. 9:27. The people who know their God shall stand firm and take action. And the wise shall understand, though for some days they will stumble by sword and flame, by captivity and plunder. When they stumble, they shall receive a little help, and many shall join themselves to them with flattery. And some of the wise shall stumble, so that they may be refined, purified, and made white until the time of the end, for it still awaits the appointed time. Now, most think those verses refer to a guy named Antiochus Epiphanes in the mid-100s BC, who was a Greek who came in and desolated the temple, offered a pig as a sacrifice. Most say that's referring to that future event. It goes on. The king will do as he wills. He will exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak astonishing things against the God of gods. He'll prosper till the indignation is accomplished, for what is decreed shall be done. He'll pay no attention to the gods of his fathers, or to the one beloved by women. He shall not pay attention to any other god, for he shall magnify himself above all. And it goes on to say things there. He'll deal with people in various ways and defeat them and divide kingdoms, etc. So some would still say that's Antiochus, but that kind of language is picked up later in the New Testament to refer to this one that we think of as Antichrist. So you go forward to 2 Thessalonians 2. 2 Thessalonians 2. It's on the day of the Lord here again. We discussed last time. He goes on to say in verse 3, let no one deceive you in any way, for that day will not come unless the rebellion comes first and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction. So the man of lawlessness, I would say, is equivalent to what we refer to as antichrist in other contexts, who opposes and exalts himself against every so-called God or object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, proclaiming himself to be God. Sounds just like Daniel 11, what we just read in that previous context. And he goes on to say there's going to be this restraining of lawlessness that's removed in that time period as well, and Jesus will come and will take him out eventually. So man of lawlessness is what it's referred to as. At that point, lawlessness is going to be unrestrained, a lot going on in terms of just lawless living, and he's going to set himself up as a god. This is in the temple of God itself. Beyond that, 1 John 2, I believe, will be another text I go to on this. Not a lot of detail. But in verse 18, 1 John 2, children, it's the last hour, and as you've heard that Antichrist is coming, so now many antichrists have come. Don't forget last time, it's the last hour, the last days began in the days of Jesus. So we're in this last hour, and Antichrist is going to come. This figure who is anti all that God is and says is coming. But even now, many antichrists have come. If you keep reading, by the way, it's like, oh, Antichrist. Yeah, those who deny Jesus, they're antichrists. Go figure. That's what it means. Deny he came in the flesh. Deny that he came at all. Read 1 John and see who the antichrists are in that sense. And then one other in Revelation 12, or 13, excuse me. Revelation 13. Very last verse of 12, he, this dragon, stood on the sand of the sea, and I saw a beast rising out of the sea with 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 diadems on its horns and blasphemous names on its heads. Now, you all know, I'm sure, the dragon, like what else has that kind of depiction? Well, the dragon has 10 horns, 7 heads as well, so it's like the dragon in that sense. And the beast that I saw was like a leopard, its feet were like a bear's, its mouth like a lion's mouth, and the dragon gave power and his throne and great authority. Now, leopard, bear, and lion should ring bells to the book of Daniel again. Daniel 7, this vision Daniel has of these foreign empires depicted like this. So this beast has qualities of all these kingdoms, but even beyond that, does worse things than that set of kingdoms in Daniel 7. One of its heads seemed to have mortal wound, but its mortal wound was healed, and the whole earth marveled as they followed the beast. Some would say it seems like maybe a false death and resurrection even, in terms of like what that means for the mortal wound. We don't know for sure on that. They worshiped the dragon, for he given authority to the beast, and they worshiped the beast, saying, who is like the beast, and who can fight against it? And the beast is given a mouth, uttering haughty and blasphemous words, and it was allowed to exercise authority over 42 months, 3.5 years. It's in his mouth to utter blasphemies against God, blaspheming his name and his dwelling, that is those who dwell in heaven. Also, it was allowed to make war on the saints and to conquer them. And authority was given to it over every tribe and people and language and nation. That's interesting, by the way, because Revelation 5, heaven has people from every tribe, tongue, nation, and language. Authority is given to it. All who dwell on earth will worship it. Everyone whose name was not been written before the foundation of the world in the book of the life of the Lamb who was slain. If anyone has an ear, let him hear. If anyone is to be taken captive, to captivity he goes. If anyone is to be slain with the sword he must be slain. Here is a call for the endurance and faith of the saints. And at the end of this chapter, by the way, you have this mark on the forehead or on the right hand of people in verse 16. And verse 18, the numbering of that is 666. It's the number of man, it says there. Threefold repetition of 6 to say there's a fullness there, and to say that the number of man is 6 in that sense. And people puzzle about that one, by the way. There's one to talk about for a while. People just puzzle, like, what's that? It's like unbelievably easy, guys. It's not a microchip in your forehead. It's not like your social security card like tattooed on your hand. It's not that. It is, read the context. It's those who worship the beast versus those who worship God. In Deuteronomy 6, it says those who love the word of God, what do they do with it? Well, they put it on their forehead and bind it on their hand. Interesting. But here, there's this mark on the forehead and the hand as well to say, We worship the beast, and we're known by that worship, and we're marked in that kind of a way. And if you don't worship this system, this world system in this way, you can't buy and sell. This sounds not that far from reality when we say in our even just Western culture, the idea of how we think through buying and selling and transactions and all these things that occur to say, if you want to do this, you need to affirm these things and say yes to these things and do it this way, or your business is done. So it's worship, I think, quite simply. So that's a few texts on Antichrist. And then you compile those and say, okay, what do they all say about this one to come? And you just jot down characteristics of that person to come, whoever it is. And beyond that, it's like, who is it? Is it Nikolai Carpathia? No. I don't know. I mean, so at that point, I don't know. Yeah, Max.
So in 1 John 2,
yeah,
it seems to be a plurality of antichrists.
Correct.
Whereas other texts seem to point to a singular person.
Mm-hmm.
How would you reconcile that difference?
Yeah, easily, because in the future it's the Antichrist, and right now many antichrists, those who are like that person to come. If you're anti what Christ teaches and who he is, you're an antichrist. So I can say of false teachers today, they're an antichrist. Are they the antichrist? No, they're an antichrist, 1 John 2 says. Yeah, they're depictions of the one to come. That's the ultimate fulfillment of that. Yeah, it's good. So they're around to this day. We shouldn't, I don't think we should hesitate to call false teachers, like John does here, antichrists, which sounds like really serious language. Well, that's because it is. That's because they are. Yeah, good. Okay, that's survey class Theology II. I'm always like, so much more to be said about this stuff. But yeah, I'm going to try to have some Q&A time beyond as well, so we'll get there. Second thing I want to do before I get into these areas is you read Blazing's chapter. It comes from this book called The Rapture, 3 views on the rapture, pre-trib, pre-wrath, or post-trib, which I'll summarize here in a few minutes. But it's one. These books are helpful in some ways. You get 3 views, and the author, like Blazing, writes his view. The other 2 authors like respond to his chapter. Then the next person, they respond to his chapter, and then at the end, it's like, let's summarize. But at the end of the day, you've got to read chapters and say, I think that the evidence goes this direction, and I affirm, believe, and am convinced of this. There's one on the millennium as well. Didn't assign this, but there's views on this that people go through. So that's what we're going to cover today, Lord willing. And briefly, I had these slides on Blazing's argument here for his article. Is this in your notes, by the way, these points here? So good. I'm just going to rapid fire work through and just summarize really fast what you read and say this. The day of the Lord in prophecy is understood as a complex event that can include several different concepts and ideas. So he's trying to argue it's not a 24-hour day. The day of the Lord includes several things. Daniel 9 builds on this day of the Lord by saying a future time suffering for God's people, the tribulation period that involves this Antichrist. Jesus builds, Matthew 24, in all the discourse. Paul then builds on that in Thessalonians, 1st and 2nd, right, with the chapters 4 and 5 in 1st, then chapter 2 and 2nd. They're not going to experience, we are not going to experience the wrath of the day of the Lord, he says in there with these texts he points to. Paul's making a logical connection between what happens at the rapture of the saints in 1 Thessalonians 4 and the beginning of the day of the Lord in 1 Thess 5. So he's trying to argue to say, okay, the day of the Lord is including this tribulation period. He promises people he's going to save us from this day. Therefore, he affirms, a pre-tribulational rapture prior to that 7 years. That's what he's arguing. 2 Thessalonians as well. He again discusses the day of the Lord and argues that it has not yet come because the final Antichrist has not yet come either. This is what Paul says there. Paul says the work of Antichrist, and as he does, he is ultimately describing the tribulation period there. And then Paul suggests in that day of the Lord will come after the apostasy, the coming of the Antichrist. Thus, the day of the Lord in that passage and elsewhere should not be understood as a brief period, but as this inclusive of many things in that era of tribulation, millennium judgment, all these things as well. That's what he's trying to argue in that chapter, that pretty lengthy chapter. I think it's a good chapter. It's well written, well argued overall, and some good points to be raised there. Now, going back to this, and what I'm going to do is just defining it really quick. Tribulation is this 7-year period, which again only comes from Daniel 9, verses 24 to 27. The book of Revelation only has 3.5 years as a time period. So it comes from there and trying to say, okay, the tribulational views that we're going to discuss here, they're trying to think through, okay, when is Christ going to catch up believers in relation to this 7-year tribulation? Because we just read 1 Thessalonians 4, which says we will all be caught up to meet the Lord in the air. So everyone believes in a rapture. Let's just say this. Everyone believes in being caught up to the Lord in the air. You have to. It's in 1 Thessalonians 4. The question is, when does that happen? When does it happen? That's the issue. So there's 3 typical views. So I'll show you these to you guys, and then let me run through these, assess, and then take questions. And then we'll do millennium, same thing. So this is very straightforward. Pre-tribulationalism versus mid versus post-tribulationalism. So you got here church age, and if you're drawing these at all or trying to see this, it's really the same kind of chart all 3 times, just moving this line down a ways each time. So pre-trib, you got church age today. Then when this catching up believers in 1 Thessalonians 4 happens, in this understanding, then this 7-year tribulation would begin. And you read Revelation and see it's a terrible time in terms of plagues, in terms of persecution of people who are here that are believing in Jesus, who they would say believe after this catching up of believers. 7 years there, and then by the end of that, Christ returns. Right, in Revelation 19, he slaughters those who rebel against him. And then the millennium dawns for 1,000 years. He binds Satan, puts him in this abyss, right? And the beast and the false prophet are thrown into the lake of fire. Millennium goes on earth. It's an earthly reign of Christ. And then at the end of that 1,000 years, Satan is released. And then he gathers nations one last time to make war, Revelation 20 says. And then he's defeated one last time and thrown into the lake of fire along with those whose names are not written in the book of life. Then you have eternal judgment or eternal life with God. That's a pre-trib kind of scheme in that sense. So you got notes there as well, just to, again, said this, but just fill this out here really quick. In this view, they're raptured out prior to the tribulation. So this position would say a gap is needed between the rapture and millennium to populate the earth with non-glorified people, some who rebel. So one question is in eschatology, okay, in Revelation 20, when Satan is released from this abyss and comes back and gathers nations, it says, to make war against the saints and the Most High, who is that? Who is he gathering? It can't be glorified, perfected people. So it must be non-glorified people come out of the tribulation into this millennial time. And so there's this gap needed there between the rapture and millennium for there to be those who would believe and come into the millennium. And the assumption is they'd have children. And they'd have children, they would populate the earth more so. Lots of assumptions, because I can't find that in the text. So just guessing we'd say they came from somewhere. Where do they come from? That's a thought on that. And again, with Blazing's article here, the day of the Lord is inclusive of rapture, tribulation, judgment, and Christ's reign. That day of the Lord, again, don't forget, in the prophets, it does depict judgment as well as salvation, both of those. So that's pre-tribulationalism there. Now, again, if you want to draw these are pretty simple. So mid-tribulationalism, just moving that arrow down a little bit. Okay, so, that's weird. There should be a block of 3.5 years as well, right here. That's strange. Anyway, so church age, there's a 3.5-year tribulation we get into, and then that catching up of believers happens, and then these advocates would say, man, the 3.5 years in Revelation that's depicted is the last 3.5 years of this 7-year period, and it's bad. It's really bad. So they would say it's this catching up of believers. The first half isn't too terrible. Second half's really bad. It's catching up with them before that time. And then same thing, millennium, eternal state, all that as well. So this view sees a difference, again, between that first and second 3.5 years that are there, and makes that a clear case. Revelation 14 is one text where it talks about the idea, right in the middle of the book of Revelation, this kind of like, hey, let's gather up this harvest of people. It's saying there, and there's wrath being poured out as well. So this view would say that's like rapture right here. I looked, verse 14, and behold, a white cloud, and seated on the cloud, one like the Son of Man, with a golden crown on his head and a sharp sickle on his hand. And another angel came out of the temple, calling with a loud voice to him who sat in the cloud, put in your sickle and reap. For the hour to reap has come, for the harvest of the earth is fully ripe. So he who sat in the cloud swung a sickle across the earth, and the earth was reaped. So the question is, like, is that people, or like what is that exactly? We don't know what the reaping is exactly. Then another angel came out at the temple with, he too had a sharp sickle, and he gathers these grapes that are ripe, and they're pressed down as like this drink of the wrath of God poured out on humanity, it says there as well. So some would say that in the middle of the book is referring to the rapture and all that. Now, if you do your timetable, it's not right in the middle of the book. So some would say some say mid-trib, some say pre-wrath, like before the real wrath starts getting dumped out, we'll be caught up and taken out of there. Then lastly is post-tribulationalism. Again, so you're moving the arrow down, right? Before, in the middle of, or after. This one here is saying, okay, right at the end of those 7 years, there's going to be a catching up of believers, and we're going to come right back down with Jesus. It's like catch up, glorified, come right back. Revelation 19. That's the idea there. Then, again, same thing. Millennium, judgment, eternal state, and all that as well. So you can see those things there. So this view advocates, again, a rapture of the church after they've gone through the tribulation, and they immediately return with Christ. So two things to say here. One key text that's gone to a lot is Matthew 25, verses 1 to 13, the parable of the 10 virgins. 5 have oil, 5 don't. The 5 that do have oil, if you recall, they hear the bridegroom is coming, and they go out to meet the bridegroom and escort him back to the house. So some would say, hey, that's a picture of this timing is we're going to be caught up to go out to meet the Lord, or go up, and then come right back with him to, come into this new reality of the millennium with him. So with that, we want to make sure, is that the point of the parable? Because the end of the parable is, so be ready. So you don't want to overinterpret there, but some would say that does definitely designate the idea of timing in that sense as well. And a lot of these advocates would say, with this, it's like, because some would say, man, it's going to be terrible, lots of wrath, crazy stuff, like food's going to be gone, water's going to be made like undrinkable, like all these crazy things, locusts and diseases and all sorts of stuff, to which some would say, well, I think it's going to be like Israel in Egypt in Exodus. When the 10 plagues came, they're going to be protected from a lot of the wrath God poured out. Like if you recall, Egypt had a lot of stuff going on, like darkness, but Goshen didn't have that darkness. They had light like usual. So they're saying, I think God will protect his people and not have them succumb to all these wrathful kind of outbursts. Issue is, we can't really see that a whole lot in the book of Revelation itself. So it's conjecture as well. So all these views say this: it's always good to affirm, like, what do all views affirm? Right? Because I would say, hope you would say too, there's a theological triage, as we discussed in class. You can be pre-trib, mid-trib, or post-trib and call yourself a Christian. Make sure we're clear on that, okay? Just say that. So I think all these views would affirm Jesus is going to return literally. He's going to return bodily. He's going to set up a kingdom. There's a literal judgment and hell. There's a literal reward, heaven, new creation. They affirm all those things. So this is an issue, I think, where you could, if you were trying to think through texts, I've got texts there to look at beyond what we looked at already, in terms of these views, to say, okay, I think there, the idea of this text seems to signify these things. I would advocate this view because of this, and a good discussion can be had in terms of trying to think through what those views are. Now, Blazing, as you guys read that, because I think it's a good argument. We here at Cedarville affirm, if you're our statement of faith here as a doctrinal statement, a pre-trib position, or those three positions there. I think Blaze is a helpful thing to look at in that regard, and we affirm that as an institution overall. So, say this and I'll pause for questions. Whatever your position would be on this, we should have, regardless, zeal to accomplish the work of God by sharing the gospel. So yeah, I'm pre-trib, I'm mid-trib, I'm post, okay, whatever. Like, regardless, we should be about making disciples of Jesus, knowing he will return. He's going to return. Even, also this, some people would say, oh man, praise the Lord, I think it's pre-trib, so no suffering for us. I've heard that from people's mouths. To which, especially nowadays, guys, we're so informed, overly informed on the web and other means. Persecution of Christians is happening all of the time. Go to persecution.org or opendoorsusa.org and just see Voice of the Martyrs or Open Doors and see daily ways you can pray for those who are being persecuted every day. Your eschatological position on tribulationalism does not mean you won't suffer for the gospel. Make that clear, because we need to know that's the case. So, like Paul says, be watchful, be ready. We don't know when Christ will come. Jesus says this also, we want to be good stewards of all he's given to us. So regardless, I want to say those points to be aware of as well. Questions on those three views of tribulation? Just trying to make sure we're clear on those. Autumn, yeah.
Which view do you claim?
Yeah, so said it last slide, I think the last point there. We affirm as an institution for faculty staff here pre-trib view. So Blaze, what you read there in terms of thinking through prior to the 7 years and why that is and how that is the day of the Lord, I'd go with Blazing's take on that for sure. Yeah, yep. Whilst having many mid-trib and well, not many mid-trib, there aren't many, that's a minority position, many post-trib friends as well. Yeah. Any others? These are easier than the next set of positions. Yeah, Max, sorry.
How would you interpret the parable of the 10 virgins?
That it's a parable about being ready for Christ's return. Yeah, that's how I interpret it. Because the last verse says what?
Watch therefore, for you know neither the day nor the hour.
That's how I interpret it. So there's a danger. Now, friends that say that this is showing this, I'm like, I can see where you're coming from. The danger in parables is overinterpreting and making every single thing in the parable mean something, when most times parables have one meaning, and they're just meant to get to that meaning. So I see it. I understand it. It makes sense. I just want to be cautious in overinterpreting those things. But I definitely see it's probably the best text to go to. One of, for sure. Yeah. Okay, so let me, go ahead.
So I was just going to say, with all of these positions, what is the mindset we should have towards the coming day of the Lord?
Yeah, if you guys wrote down, hopefully you did, 2 or 3 classes ago, like what can we be sure of in terms of eschatology and what are the implications of those things? That's what we should be having our posture of toward the day of the Lord. Hope, readiness, evangelistic zeal. What else we talk about? Faith in the Lord and his promises that he will return and do what he said to do. Those are the kinds that you see again and again and again. First Peter is a big one, right? Be sober-minded, be ready, pursue holiness. Dr. McKinney preached yesterday on a few things there in terms of being ready for that day to come. So that's what I would say. I would say regardless, it should have the same kind of feel to it and flavor to it. And I feel like we're, just to be honest for myself, maybe for you as well, I feel like we're sometimes so enraptured with this present world and living for these purposes of this world, we tend to not see well enough of the future to impact us to live rightly for the future, if that makes sense. Just to say, like, we need to look, people say they're so heavenly minded, they're of no earthly good. That's a dumb phrase. So here's why I think Colossians 3 tells us Set your minds on things where? Above, where Christ is, see the hand of God. Set your minds on things above, not on things of the earth, for you've died. I think we need to get more into that mindset, and eschatology helps us get more into that mindset as well. Yeah. Okay. If you turn to Revelation 20, we'll see here the one place, mentioned 6 times, but the one place where we see the phrase 1,000 years. There's nowhere else in the Bible that says that phrase 1,000 years like this 6 times in this chapter. There are other places that we say could allude to it, like Isaiah 65. But this is the one place where we'd say, well, there's this millennial depicting. So could someone read for us verses 1 through 6 of Revelation 20?
Then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, holding in his hand the key to the bottomless pit and a great chain. And he seized the dragon, the ancient serpent, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years, and threw him into the pit, and shut it and sealed it over him, so that he might not deceive the nations any longer, until the 1,000 years were ended. After that, he must be released for a little while. Then I saw thrones, and seated on them were those to whom the authority to judge was committed. Also I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded for the testimony of Jesus and for the word of God, and those who had not worshipped the beast or its image, and had not received its mark on their foreheads or their hands. They came to life and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. The rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were ended. This is the first resurrection. Blessed and holy is the one who shares in the first resurrection. Over such the second death has no power, but they will be priests of God and of Christ, and they will reign with him for 1,000 years.
Okay, thank you. So this is a text that is, again, debated, and again, we see 3 views that are often talked about. So I'm gonna work through these as well, and just try to define these and make sense of them. So, yeah, I'll start going through them and go back to this text because there's a lot in the text to think about as well. So the first one's called Amillennialism. So a guy named Sam Storms says this, contrary to what this name implies, amillennialist, because you guys know, but like if you had an A, or an alpha in this case, to a word, an alpha privative, it negates. So like a theist believes in God, an atheist believes in no God. So here, amillennialism sounds like no millennium. And he's trying to say, well, it's not quite accurate. He says, the millennium, however, is now, he argues. So what Zach just read, Sam Storms would say, that reality is now. The present age of the church between the first and second comings of Christ in its entirety is the millennium, he says. This Messianic reign is not precisely 1,000 years in length, obviously, right? And it is wholly spiritual. And so what it is, he's saying the millennium is, from Christ's first coming to second coming, it's saints reigning with Christ in heaven. So right now, he would say the millennial reign is happening, and it's happening right now in heaven. If you die, you're going to be the Lord, and that's what Zach just read. That's describing heavenly realities of reigning with Christ till he comes back to come on the earth. So in terms of charts, the best strength of this is that it's really simple. There's your chart. It's really easy. So you have the church age. You put it like if you're drawing this, like put it above heaven, right? Reign of the saints with Christ. And then below on earth, we are experiencing tribulation, which will climax at the very end to be the great tribulation that we experience. Christ returns. There is no millennium to be had because it's already being had in heaven right now. And we just go straight to judgment and new heavens, new earth, or lake of fire. That's that. Again, so that's positioned there in terms of thinking through what it is. You have your Bibles open. Any issues come to mind as you think upon this kind of position for amillennialism? It's spiritual, it's heavenly, taking place right now. And then you think of biblically, you look at it and say, I got some questions about that. Let me pose one for you to start thinking about this. In verse 1 and 2, what's happening? Satan gets locked up, right? To no longer deceive the nations, it says there in verse 2, right? or verse 1. You seen that? How does the New Testament describe Satan's activity right now? What are some verses you can go to describing Satan's activity? Say again. God in this world, 2 Corinthians 4:4. What else? Prince of the power of the air, Ephesians 6. What else do we hear Satan's activity described in the New Testament? 1 Peter 5, he's a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. John 10, the thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. To Max's point, in 2 Corinthians 4:4, the God of this world has blinded the minds of unbelievers to keep them from seeing the light of the gospel. And there's a few more we can go to as well. When I read Revelation 20, it sounds like Satan's activity is really negated. And I have to ask the question based on other texts, is it yet negated? And my answer would be, I don't think so. I think he's still very active right now doing what he's doing. And we see him in various texts doing destruction, deception, all these things. So if you're going to argue, hey, this is heavenly and Satan is already bound and there is not deceiving the nations any longer, I just don't see that as being a tenable kind of position. Adrian, yeah?
What do you think it would look like when Satan is bound, but humans are still depraved, like for that period of time?
Yeah. At the very least, we can say 1 John 2, the idea of the world, the flesh, and the devil, there not being a devil or a world that is going to be a source of temptation that way. We have to say, I think, there's something there for non-glorified humans to be able to, once a deceiver comes back and deceives them, to be deceived and make war against the saints. Beyond that, how it will look, I don't know. But we know world and devil will be removed from that equation in that way as well. Yeah. Note this as well in chapter 19. One thing to think of. In verse 20, the beast is captured, and with it the false prophet who's in his presence had done the signs which he deceived those who received the mark of the beast. These two were thrown alive into the lake of fire that burns with sulfur. The rest were slain, etc., etc. Then Satan is bound. And then, verse 10, chapter 20, the devil who had deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur where the beast and the false prophet were. And we tormented day and night forever and ever. So my understanding of 19 and 20 Revelation is that it's sequential. Like 19 happens, and then 20 happens. This view says, actually, 19 and 20, 20 is here's a big word, 20 is a recapitulation of 19. What it means is it's a retelling of the same story from a different angle. Which I read 19 and 20 and say, this isn't the same. You read it. I read 19 and 20 and say, this is just not the same exact story. It's a sequential defeat, beast, false prophet thrown in the lake of fire, Satan locked up, Satan released, defeated, and he's thrown in the lake of fire where the beast and false prophet already were. There's a sequence to that I see. So in terms of trying to think through Satan's activity and the sequencing of 19 and 20, I just don't think this is a tenable position. Again, I have friends who claim it and say this is what it is. I just have issues, and more. Those are a couple issues I have with that kind of viewpoint. Postmillennialism. Now, this is a very, very minority, very small group believe this. Ken Gentry. Postmillennialism expects the proclaiming of the Spirit-blessed gospel of Jesus Christ to win the vast majority of human beings to salvation in the present age. Increasing gospel success will gradually produce a time in history prior to Christ's return in which faith, righteousness, peace, and prosperity will prevail in the affairs of people and nations. Like Lifeway and Chick-fil-A everywhere, right? After extreme aorist conditions, the Lord will return, visibly bodily, with great glory, and the history of the general resurrection and the great judgment of all mankind. So with that, think of it this way. Reality history is getting increasingly better. The world is getting increasingly, if you will, gospelized, okay? And as they believe more and more, there's going to come, they often say this golden era wherein the vast, vast majority of the world is believing in the gospel of Jesus Christ. There's this golden age of time where it's just really good and beautiful and gospel-centered. And Jesus is not there yet. He returns at the very end. But there's this time of just real bliss and peace and all this. That's what the millennium is referring to. So history is getting better and better in that regard. Now, this was actually like one of my heroes, Jonathan Edwards. I love reading this guy. He was post-mill, which I'm like, because I just don't see this again. This view was pretty popular for a couple centuries, 18th, 19th century especially. And then in the 1940s and 50s, it really dropped off, like big time, as a view. So what happened in the 1940s? Yeah, World War II. And now there's no coincidence here to say the world's getting better and better and better and better. Well, people lived through 2 world wars and recognized, man, it seems as though the betterment of society isn't necessarily like, even in all of history, people can say, is it really getting better? Or are we just saying there's some good and there's lots of sin there as well we can look at and see? So that's some things that are there. Again, with this chapter, I think the idea of not having Jesus present in the millennium seems to negate chapter 19 of Revelation, because he returns and this happens. So that's a key thing there as well. But question to this one? This is, again, a minority view. Not many would hold to this, but any questions, thoughts here on this view? Postmillennialism? Okay. Say a lot more on all of these, but that's another one. So Amill, heavenly millennium, right now. Post-mill, earthly millennium, someday prior to Jesus' return. Premillennialism, one of this view here today. God declared that he would fill the earth with his glory in Numbers 14:21, Jim Hamilton says. It's true that even now, as disciples are made in all nations, the glory of God is expanding across the world. Revelation 20 teaches that after Armageddon, in 19, the beast and the false prophet will be thrown in a lake of fire, Satan will be imprisoned, and for 1,000 years, Jesus will reign with his resurrected followers. They will cover the earth with the knowledge of the glory of God in a way that brings maximal fulfillment to every promise in the Bible. I would say it should include the new creation as well. But just the idea of here, now premillennialism, try to say, here's the idea, amillennialism. No earthly millennium, it's heavenly. Postmillennialism, the post means Jesus will return after the millennium on earth. Premillennialism means Jesus returns before the millennial reign on earth. I'll say it again. Amil, let's jot this down. Amil, no earthly millennium. It's heavenly. Post-mill. Christ returns after the millennium. Pre-mill. Christ returns before the millennium. Again, I would say if you read Revelation 19 and then 20 and see them sequentially, you'd recognize, right, Christ comes, defeats enemies, binds Satan, millennial reign. That's the order of events we see in that way. Now, there are, how do I say this simply here? But just to finish up today, there are 2 views on this. Now, I'll bring up here. So, the 2 kinds of premillennialists, to say it this way, there's 2 kinds. One is pre-trib, one is post-trib, to say it that way. There's mid-trib as well, they're very minority. So, in premillennialism, premillennialism can include like pre-trib and post-trib as well, which we already described there. Amill and post-mill are always going to be post-trib. They always affirm a post-trib rapture. So this one here, it could refer to a mid-trib as well. Most often it's referring to a pre- or post-trib there. So also known as, I have here like the HP is historic premillennialism, and the DP is dispensational premillennialism. For time's sake, I'll show you guys next time those 2 charts there, but same as pre-trib and post-trib. But again, just trying to say, if you're pre-mill, this is like a a book you open, like, okay, choose this view. Now with that, you've got one or two views like this, or it opens these views. Or so with that, as you see millennialism, you're going to as well, okay, that's going to dictate in some ways my tribulational view as well. So with that, a premill view can have, again, this pre-tribulational or post-tribulational idea with it attached, and it's called by theologians historic premill, dispensational premill. It's a lot there. We'll review next time we go through that because, again, it's trying to think through all those viewpoints. What are they? How do they exist? Key thing is this. We're trying to think through especially what's the relation, tribulationalism, between us as God's people and the rapture. Millennium, trying to think through, okay, where does Jesus fit in terms of coming into this millennium? Heavenly, earthly, before, after, all this stuff happens, where does Jesus fit in that? That's what we're trying to answer in those views.